Hemdale, Orion, Carolco, MGM, Skydance. These 5 companies spanned 4 decades of production, yet throughout that entire history, one face never changed hands because it was never his to begin with. On October 26, 1984, the world saw a machine on the silver screen, but the real machine was the legal structure that owned him. This is a forensic investigation into how the face of a $1.8 billion franchise walked away with a salary instead of an asset, and why the contract that made this possible was not a mistake, but deliberate industry architecture. Arnold Schwarzenegger received $75,000 to play the T-800, and on a $6.4 million budget, that figure appeared logical to everyone involved at the time. Because the film was an independent production, no major studio provided guaranteed backing, which left Hemdale Film Corporation to carry the full financial risk alone. The studio argued that a low budget and an unknown director justified a flat fee for a role with limited dialogue, so Arnold was told to do the work and collect his check. What this framing conveniently ignored was the other half of the deal. Buried inside the Hemdale agreement sat a 1+2 option clause, and this dry legal shorthand locked Arnold into sequel rates based on 1984 values. These rates were not adjusted for inflation or tied to the future performance of the franchise, but were instead frozen at the exact moment the film looked like a small gamble. The reality was that a $6.4 million independent project was about to become a cultural institution, yet the pay scale remained stuck in the past. By the time the first movie hit theaters, Arnold was already legally forbidden from asking for a raise on the next 2 films. The rates were locked in before anyone knew the movie would make a single dollar. Arnold later admitted he thought he was just betting on a quick breakthrough, even calling the project some movie he was doing for a few weeks. Hemdale was playing a much longer game by betting on the ability to own his likeness for decades to come. When the film opened on October 26, 1984, it appeared on 1,005 screens and earned $4 million during its first weekend. By the time the theatrical run ended, the movie had pulled in $78 million worldwide on that original $6.4 million budget, representing a massive 12-fold return on investment. While word of mouth built the momentum and Arnold built the icon, the option clause ensured the studio would be the one to profit from both. To understand the full scope of this, we have to look at the role Orion Pictures played as the domestic distributor. In a standard distribution agreement, the studio does not fully finance the film, but instead handles the release and takes a cut of the gross receipts off the top. Orion protected its own position with gross receipts participation, which meant they collected money from the very first dollar before any other costs were even applied. Arnold's backend sat on the net profit side of the ledger. And in Hollywood, net profits are only calculated after the studio deducts production costs, marketing overhead, and interest. In 1984, this formula was specifically designed to report zero profits, even on films that made money, which left the talent with very little recourse. The franchise eventually generated $1.8 billion at the box office, yet Arnold's total earnings across every appearance sit somewhere between $45 and $60 million. This massive gap between what the machine earned and what the man collected is the focus of our investigation. Option stacking was the specific legal trap that created this wealth gap, and it functioned as a mechanism to lock in an actor's value before they became a superstar. When a studio signs a performer for one film plus 2 sequels at prices set on day one, that actor loses the ability to say no to a sequel without walking away from the entire franchise. The studio captures every dollar of growth while the talent stays stuck on the price they agreed to before the first ticket ever sold. The Screen Actors Guild, which we now know as SAG-AFTRA, set benchmarks for these exact types of clauses during the 1980s by requiring escalators tied to box office performance. Arnold's contract sat below that floor on a film that eventually became one of the most profitable independent productions in Hollywood history. To see how much that distinction actually mattered, we can look at what was happening at the same time with a different action star. Sylvester Stallone famously wrote the Rocky script in just 3 days, and when United Artists offered to buy the project, he refused to sell unless he was the one starring in it. The real difference in his deal wasn't the starring role, but rather what he demanded in the legal paperwork. Stallone negotiated for 10% of the net profits, and, more importantly, access to the film negative. In the movie business, whoever owns that negative owns the actual asset, and Stallone understood that the contract itself was the prize rather than just the salary. Both men started their respective journeys at $75,000, yet the legal bones underneath those deals were entirely different from the very beginning. Stallone chose to bet on the machine he built himself, while Arnold became a part of a machine that the studio owned. While Stallone was building a family legacy he could pass down to his children, Arnold was effectively renting out his own face to a rotating list of billionaires who would trade it between themselves for decades. If we track where the money went once the franchise started generating real revenue, the disparity becomes even more obvious. Hemdale held a 50% stake alongside producer Gail Ann Hurd, and in 1990, they sold that half to Carolco Pictures for $10 million. Carolco used that stake to fund Terminator 2 before they went bankrupt 5 years later and had the rights auctioned off in court. C2 Pictures eventually assembled the pieces and sold them to Halcyon Holding Group for $25 million in 2007. By the time 2009 arrived, Halcyon was claiming the franchise was worth over $60 million during their own bankruptcy proceedings. More than 8 companies traded those rights over 4 decades, and every single transaction made a profit for someone who never once stood in front of a camera. Arnold had no legal standing in any part of that chain because he wasn't a rights holder or a creditor. Public access to court electronic records shows his name appearing in these proceedings only as a contracted performer rather than a party with a claim on the asset. His option clause gave the studio the right to keep him around at a price locked in years before, and that clause wasn't just fine print, it was the entire reason the deal existed. By 1991, Arnold's paycheck had jumped to $15 million for the second film, and that number hit $30 million for Terminator 3 in 2003. At the time, that was the highest salary any actor had ever received for a single movie, which meant the studio was paying more to rent his time than it cost to make the original film. While that number sounds like a position of power, the reality was that a salary is just a fee for work that ends the moment the cameras stop rolling. Arnold's ownership in those films stayed exactly where it started in 1984, and that number was 0. This is where the final layer of the legal system becomes clear, and it shows why being a creator matters more than being a star in the eyes of the law. Gail Ann Hurd was the producer who originally bought the rights from James Cameron for a single dollar, and she had a legal path available to her that Arnold never did. Thanks to a law passed by Congress in the 1970s, creators can actually file to take back their intellectual property rights 35 years after they were first published. Hurd moved to use that right to reclaim her 50% stake starting in late 2020, and James Cameron had the same legal standing to do so. Arnold had nothing because the law was designed to protect the people who create the ideas rather than the people who act them out. In the eyes of the law, performers don't create, they just execute a plan. And that distinction became a wall between Arnold and the franchise he helped build. Those consequences landed in 2019 with the release of Terminator: Dark Fate, where Arnold and Cameron returned for what the studio marketed as a franchise homecoming. It earned $261 million and still lost money because production and marketing costs had ballooned beyond what a fractured brand could support. The franchise had survived 4 bankruptcies and 8 different owners, but no single company had ever held it long enough to protect its value. They were each too focused on extracting what they could before passing the property to the next buyer. That same logic is inside contracts being signed right now as studios lock actors into today's rates for AI training data and digital likeness rights. This technology hasn't been fully deployed yet, but it functions as the old option clause with a new name. The architecture is identical to what Arnold signed 40 years ago, and it proves the system didn't fail Arnold Schwarzenegger. It worked exactly as it was designed to. Arnold Schwarzenegger may have built the icon, but the studio system owned the asset. That single dollar James Cameron accepted from Gail Ann Hurd grew into a $1.8 billion franchise that spent decades drifting through bankruptcy courts while the original creators watched from the sidelines. The $75,000 Arnold collected became a blueprint for the industry, and its logic remains visible in every options clause and net profit formula being signed today by actors who think they are finally catching their break. The contract was never a starting point for talent, as it functioned more like a ceiling designed to limit their upward mobility. The next time you see the word standard on a legal document, remember what it meant here. In the eyes of Hollywood, standard is just another word for sold. If you want more forensic investigations into the legal mechanics the industry prefers to keep hidden, subscribe and check the playlist. The next case is already waiting.